Designing for Neurodiversity, a perspective on that rethinks inclusivity. Joining us today, we have Arnold C. Levin, who will be discussing the real-world challenges that neurodiverse individuals face at work and what designers can do better to help support these neurodiverse populations. Arnold is the founder of CWI, a strategic design consultancy focused on organizational design-driven workplace solutions. He was previously the Southwest Regional Strategy Director at Gensler, and he brings over 45 years of experience in design strategy, organizational design, and workplace design and design research. So let's welcome Arnold to the stage.
Can everybody hear me? Great. So I apologize. My daughter Zoe, who I was going to be giving this talk with, when she got off the plane yesterday, was sneezing. By the time she woke up this morning, it was a full-blown cold. And in light of everything that's going on in the world of disease, pandemic, infections, felt it was better that I would do this by myself. So I apologize for her not being here. I know most people came to hear her and not me. And she probably would have given a much more enlightening conversation about neurodiversity, given her background with dealing with dyslexia and ADHD for her whole childhood. Do I have a clicker? No. Oh, okay. So that is Zoe over there. You know, in lieu of having the typical, AI-generated photographs that everybody uses these days, I thought it would be more appropriate to have one that was a little bit more informal when she and I were having dinner together. Zoe's. I'll talk a little bit about Zoe's background, which I think is really pertinent to the talk, but also pertinent to how it's really impacted and informed how I think about designing spaces for neurodiversity and what the impact of that is. Next slide. So, I've been doing this for 50 years, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it. As the introduction said, I spent most of my life working, in large, national and international architectural and design firms, both in terms of leading design projects, and more recently leading strategy projects. And needless to say, 50 years, hopefully has taught me an awful lot about what we do in the profession as designers. And I keep constantly getting, informed by my daughter, Zoe, about how things are not as we typically see it as designers. Even though we always talk about the user experience, we talk about designing from the user perspective, I'm not sure that we quite get it all the time, particularly when it comes to neurodivergent issues as it impacts the workplace. Next. So again, a lot of this is really, lessons from my daughter. It begs the question, when we talk about, all these spaces that we're designing, are we really solving the right problem well, or are we solving the right problem not particularly well? And often, if a space looks phenomenal and it's photographed and it gets published, we think that's success. But often, we're not necessarily solving what the right problem is. And what I want to talk a little bit about this afternoon, is, designing for neurodiversity. Are we really focusing on what that right problem is? And is space alone the solution? And I think, it's somewhat heretical, as both a designer, but also talking probably to an audience, mostly of designers, I would imagine, of some sort, space, unfortunately, and that's what 50 years has taught me, is not always the only solution to solving our clients' problems. Yet that's what we focus on because it's what gives us joy. It's what we've been taught to do in school, and it's and it gives us a lot of our fulfillment and purpose in life. But I think as designers, we have a responsibility to our clients and the people who are actually using the spaces that we're designing for to think a little bit differently. Next. So that's Zoe. Zoe was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD, in third grade. After spending the first couple of years of life struggling in school. I knew nothing about what that meant except the fact that I thought that, if one is dyslexic, one reads backwards and all that type of stuff. But fortunately, she was able to get into a school in Washington, D.C. called the Lab School of Washington. which focuses on children, who are neurodiverse. And it was a huge opening both for her in terms of what they gave her in terms of tools, for being able to advocate for herself. But also when you looked at how the school was established and set up, it was based on choice and on, flexibility. A lot of what we talk about in the world today as designers. Over the years, as she's taken the tools that she learned at the lab school, she's managed to self-advocate for herself both in school, in lower grades, but she went on to she was accepted in 5 different universities, which is rare for kids who have dyslexia and ADHD. The rate of going to college is very low. She ended up going here to Columbia College in Chicago. And now she's back in graduate school for a second graduate degree, where she's going back for social work. Next. So in 2017, I wrote an article for WorkDesign magazine, on what I learned from my daughter about design and strategy. And what I learned was that the things that I had, been promoting as a designer, really was not very well founded, if my daughter was going to be living in any of the spaces that I was designing. Next one. If I would design a space that was open like this, which a lot of us do, and when I had a client that said, oh, I can't work in the open, I would sort of, slough that off, to being, that person really was, wanted to keep their private office, because of, title and, working in that company for 20, 30 years, that they deserve that space. And then I began to look and I realized, if my daughter was to take a job, and this happened to be Capital One in Virginia, at Capital One, and she was stuck out there in the open, she wouldn't be able to function. And it began to let me think about very differently about the types of spaces that we were doing. And this was, back in 2014, well before the pandemic, well before we were talking about hybrid work and that type of thing. Next one. So I think, what we learned over the years, is the importance of choice and agency in terms of self-advocacy. The whole, and I think the pandemic has really brought that to fruition. We've been adopting a lot more activity-based work, than we have before the pandemic because of the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic. But I think we haven't really gone far enough in thinking about what that impact is, to people who have, neurodivergent issues. Next one. So again, what's interesting, this is a rendering of the lab school in Washington. This was back in 2018, well before the pandemic, well before anybody was talking about, activity-based work, where you would be able to walk through a space and choose the type of work setting that you were doing. Back at the lab school, they were doing that as part of the education. It was natural. It didn't take a bunch of workplace designers and strategists to come up with this brilliant concept that a lot of us have been promoting over the years. And so there was a lot to learn about what, people who were actually in the trenches involved with dealing with diversity in terms of, dyslexia and ADHD, and other issues, where it impacts working in a physical office space. Next. So what I want to really do for everybody here, is to really, challenge some, current assumptions, that we all have. And there's been a lot written over the past 5 years on neurodiversity, which is great. It's the first time historically that we've been focusing on these issues. But what I began to see as I've been reading everybody's, thoughts about it, is that they're focusing on activity-based work, which is good to a certain degree, but they really haven't gone far enough in really trying to solve what the real problem is and what we could bring to the table as designers and architects and strategists. So again, we design these wonderful spaces now, that are diverse. You could go into a space for quiet. You could go into a space if you're doing teamwork. You could go into a different space in terms of being able to collaborate, with your colleagues. And all of this makes a lot of sense when it comes to neurodiversity, and designing spaces. Because again, somebody like my daughter Zoe, would be able to work with a team in potentially an open setting. She'd be able to go into a small, short stay room to be able to, close the world off, to be able to focus on the work that she was doing. But, we've taken that a step further, and we've been talking about, activity-based work where there's non-assigned seating. Is that a problem or not? And as designers, I don't think that we really looked into that well enough. Next one. I spent the first half of my career, involved with design, and then I went back to graduate school for an MBA and then a degree in organizational design. And one of the things that I learned, which I brought to my design practice, has been, are we really looking at how the organization is established to cope with any of the things that we want to? If a client tells us we want to be collaborative, is that client really designed as an organization to be collaborative? Is designing a bunch of coffee bars the solution? Or is it really causing more of a problem than it is? And so what we look at in the world of organizational design is, what's the strategy of the business? What are their work processes? What are their people? What is their reward systems? And what I wanted to sort of, bring to the table here is those are the things that we need to be looking at with our clients when we're talking about designing spaces, for a neurodivergent workforce. The spaces by themselves aren't going to solve the problem. Is the organization capable of being designed as a business entity or a business enterprise in order to be able to handle people who are neurodivergent and be able to have the policies and the protocols that go along with that? Because the spaces by themselves are not going to do that. Next. One of the things that Zoe taught me most recently is, I told her about a space that I had done, in Salt Lake City for an organization that was purely activity-based, and nobody had assigned seating. Designers think, wow, that's brilliant. It's great. There's choice, there's freedom, there's agency, there's flexibility. The problem was that she pointed out to me was that if you're neurodiverse, particularly with ADHD, security is a big issue. The security of having a place to go and sit down that's your own, is huge, if you're neurodivergent. And many of us who aren't dealing with that, aren't aware of that. And I think that, too often, we think that we, embrace and encompass and include, people who are neurodivergent, like my daughter, but we really aren't asking them, what are the issues? How does a space like this, impact their life? If she had to be able to move from table to table every single day, she said that, she would be totally, incapacitated in terms of being able to work and handle that situation. Next. So again, what I want to leave everybody here with at the end of this conversation, is that it is all about advocacy, and being able to design for people who can advocate for themselves, both individually. And one of the things that she learned, going through the lab school was how to advocate for herself, what she needs in terms of the type of workspaces that she needs to be able to do, to be effective, in whatever endeavor that she's doing. But there also needs to be organizational advocacy. And that is critical. And I think as designers and architects and strategists, we too often forget that piece of the puzzle because we're not trained that way in school, particularly in undergraduate design school, where, the organization is a huge part of this. And is the organization capable of being able to handle people who are neurodivergent, even with the spaces that we're designing? So I will leave you with that, and hopefully I did everything within 15 minutes. I spoke like a New Yorker, even though I live in Seattle. Any questions that you have, I'd love to answer. And I can pretend that I'm Zoe, and I can answer for her as well.
Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.